Today I'm going to be talking about the film Rope. It was directed by Alfred Hitchcock and released in 1948. The main thing that I find interesting about the film is the relationship between the three main characters, Brandon, Phillip, and Rupert. Within the film, their relationships twist around each other and are explored in a way that was very, I'd say, modern for the time, I suppose. So I would like to focus on those three relationships today. The first one I'm going to talk about is Brandon and Phillip's relationship together, because they are the main characters in the movie and they are the main couple. Now, Philip and Brandon are never officially stated to have homosexual relations or to be living together, because the film was operating under the Hays Code, but they're obviously living together. There's several lines within the movie that strongly imply this, and their actions and their behavior towards each other throughout the film makes it clear that they are definitely gay and in a committed long-term relationship with each other. A lot of people come away from this movie thinking that Brandon is manipulative of Philip and that Philip only went along with him because he was sort of carried away, which is it's the same sort of interpretation that people give the case that the movie is based on, the Leopold and Loeb case. And they say that Nathan was carried away by what Richard Loeb wanted him to do, but that's untrue. Philip was not manipulated in Rope, and neither was Nathan manipulated by Richard, but I mean, that's another discussion. Philip has his own faults, I suppose you would say, although I don't really see him as I don't really see them as faulted characters, but I'm gonna get into that later. Philip has his own coldness about him, and he's just as sly and manipulative, I suppose, as Brandon, but he's in a more underhanded way, so it's easier to overlook it. But there's a scene at the beginning of the movie when, before the main guests have come, Brandon is talking to Philip about the party, and he says, this will be the most exciting party that was ever given, and Philip says, with these people, and he's really condescending and sneering about it to show that he thinks he's better than all of them, just like Brandon keeps saying that he thinks he's better. I mean, it's not just Brandon who thinks that, obviously. Then, later on, Kenneth comes, and they tell Kenneth that they invited David and Janet both to the party. And Kenneth says, I can't believe you've invited Janet because she and I broke up. And Brandon and Philip both pretend total ignorance of this fact, even though they obviously knew beforehand. Brandon says, I didn't know, and Kenneth turns to Philip and says, oh, well, I'm sure you knew. And Philip says, no, I heard vague rumors, but I don't really ever pay attention to that kind of stuff. And Kenneth says, well, I wish you had. And when Philip says why, you have to watch his mouth. It's very subtle, but he's like sneering at Kenneth. He's like, and when he says vague rumors too, I mean, he doesn't think anything of Kenneth. He thinks he's better than Kenneth. And the way he goes to stand beside Brandon, he's like they're laughing at him. They've obviously talked about this before, and they think it's really funny that they're both standing here getting one over on old Kenneth, which, I mean, fine, let them have their fun. I don't really see the problem with that. I mean, besides it just being a movie, they obviously enjoy each other's company, so it's not like, you know. So what I'm saying is it's obviously not like Philip's being just totally pushed into this and coerced into it, because he obviously enjoys what he's doing just as much as Brandon does. But he's less overt about it. But just because he's the more recalcitrant of the two, it doesn't mean that he's totally me, I suppose you would say. Also, on that topic, Brandon gets a really bad rap, but he's not the worst person in the whole movie. I mean, from a moralistic standpoint, you would say he was the worst, but he's human. He's got just as many faults as everybody else in the film, and he's obviously really, really nervous, especially once Rupert comes, which I'll talk about again in a little bit. But even before that, he's obviously really trying to make Philip feel like better about what they did, because at the start of the movie, you see Philip kill David, and then you see Philip getting really sort of nervous about the whole thing and kind of like stooped over, scared, kind of shaky, can't really think for himself. Brandon has to take his gloves off for him, etc. So Brandon wants Philip to enjoy everything that they've done, because, I mean, clearly they planned this together for a really long time, and clearly when they were planning it, Brandon was the one who was kind of like, oh, well, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and Philip was like, yeah, okay, that sounds good, whatever you want. Because, I mean, that's just the kind of relationship that they have, where Brandon has the ideas, and Philip says, okay, because, I mean, let's be real, with intense people, it's easier to just go along with what they say, because then it's not like you're saying, oh, well, I have this idea and it's better, because the Brandon in the relationship isn't going to go along with whatever the Philip is going to say. But, I mean, that's not to say that Philip is manipulated. It's just saying that's the kind of person that Brandon is. He has a sort of, like I said, he has an intensity, and probably, I mean, this is just speculation, but probably it was very much misunderstood by the people that he grew up around. I mean, he's clearly not the one that everyone at the party favors. I mean, Mr. Kentley says nice things about him, but that's Mr. Kentley. Mr. Kentley is a parent. I mean, your parents don't know you the way that, like, your contemporaries do, obviously. So Mr. Kentley thinks he's nice, but Janet clearly knows that he's, you know, shallow, and Kenneth doesn't really like him all that much either. And the film sort of portrays not even Philip is really liking him, but, I mean, I think it's just like an hour and a half in an evening in their lives. We don't know what kind of relationship they had outside of that. So Philip probably is the first person who ever didn't just shove Brandon's whims aside whenever he wanted to do something kind of weird, like when they were in school and whatever it is that Rupert's talking about, that he said, oh, well, you wanted to do weird stuff for the excitement of it and the danger. Philip went along with all the stuff that Brandon wanted to do. He admired him, obviously. But with that cruelty that I talked about, there was also a part of Philip that really actually wanted to do all that stuff. So Brandon enjoyed that he didn't have to feel like he was forcing Philip into doing things with him the way he had felt like he had to force his former companions, Kenneth or David or whoever he was hanging out with before, into doing things. And that's just something I think personally. But besides all that intensity and that arrogance that Brandon displays, it's just a stand-in for insecurity. I mean, he's obviously very, very insecure in himself. I mean, why else would he have gone out of his way to get that kind of attention by killing someone? And you don't just do that if you have a normal mindset. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm going to talk about Brandon's insecurities with regards to Rupert in a bit. With regard to Brandon and Philip's relationship by itself, I I mean, Philip has stuck with him since, quote, that very first day in prep school, which he talks about, and he says Brandon's frightened him since then. But I mean, it's not just that Brandon frightened him, and so that's why they've hung out all this since then. I mean, it's been about 8 years, I'd suppose, since their first day, but clearly something else besides just Brandon frightening him has kept him there. And him being friends with Brandon for all those years means that he knows what kind of person Brandon is. But he stayed with him anyway. I mean, it's not like Philip was just sitting there like, oh, trala, I don't know what kind of person Brandon is. Oh my god, he wants to kill somebody. That's horrible. You don't just go from being like, oh, well, we're friends, to being like, let's murder someone together in the space of like 3 seconds. It takes time, it takes years of planning, etc., etc. I mean, they probably pulled weird pranks together, like I said, together before, and it led up to that. So Philip was aware of what he was doing. And Philip is aware of what kind of person Brandon is: arrogant, conceited, manipulative, pretentious, superiority complex, what have you. Whatever feelings of insecurity he's hiding, Philip's probably aware of those, but he loves him anyway. I mean, he lives with him in an apartment. He killed someone with him. They were supposed to go on a vacation together after this. They have a housekeeper together. They have a shared bank account, apparently, because Brandon's checkbooks are the only ones in the house. So obviously, they're living off Brandon's income. You don't get a joint checking account with somebody you don't love. So Philip, just because Philip is more recalcitrant about everything doesn't mean that he's like a total sub. And I mean, it's not like he's just going along with whatever Brandon says because he's scared of him. He wants to do all that stuff too because he loves him, and because he's not a nice person like everyone thinks he is. I mean, why Brandon's that kind of person? He keeps saying, oh, well, there's superior people and then there's inferior people, and superiors should stay away from inferiors because there's no reason for any of them to interact. Why would Brandon, a person like that, stay with Philip if all he had to him was that he was a submissive, whiny sort of, oh, well, I'll do whatever you want because you said so, Brandon, blah, 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 kind of person? He wouldn't. Philip's got something to him. His recalcitrance doesn't mean his total, like I've said already in this video. I mean, Brandon doesn't like boring people. The Davids of this world merely occupy space. David was a boring person, and Philip isn't. So, and you have to remember, in the end, if nothing else, Philip's the one who killed David to begin with. I mean, Philip's the one who is holding the rope when the camera pans out. So it's not like he was the one holding David's body up and he was, accessory in the first degree or whatever the term is, I forgot. But Philip's the one who was holding it. Philip's the one who had the strong hands. I mean, Brandon probably commented on that for years and years. Like, oh, your hands are so strong, Philip, blah, blah, blah. You can do so much with your hands. Chicken strangler. Let's be real. Let's be real. But as stated earlier, now I'm going to move on to another relationship before I get too meta about Brandon and Phillip and all the little soft things that they might do together. That's headcanon. That's a totally other topic. Brandon and Rupert. Now, there is the second relationship in this movie out of 3 that's the main relationships. As stated earlier, Rupert obviously has a major effect on Brandon. I mean, look, the very first scene that Rupert comes in, he comes in and he walks up and he's like, your piano playing has improved, or your touch has improved. That's what he says. And Philip like jumps, and then Brandon walks over and he's like, oh, Rupert, you're here. And he starts stammering and like bouncing around him like a child, or like, I always think of him as like a puppy in that scene. Because he's clearly been waiting for Rupert to come. He starts looking at his watch while they're all standing around talking at one point. When Janet's sitting on the piano bench, Kenneth's standing by the bookshelf, and Philip is standing by the piano next to Janet, Brandon starts looking at his watch. Poor baby, as they say. So I don't know what kind of life Brandon had prior to meeting Rupert, but he looks at him as a father figure. It's really obvious. I mean, not just as a father figure, like he obviously has a crush on him or he's in love with him or something, but it started out as him seeing him as a father figure because it's, you know, it's natural. A mentor in school, at a boarding school, you'd see them as such. But Rupert doesn't see Brandon as, you know, like, if you've seen Dead Poet Society, that's a healthy, normal relationship between a mentor and his students, but this is not at all that. Because the first thing that Rupert does is he walks around and he kind of makes fun of everybody there. He doesn't really make fun of them, but he condescends to them in a way that's really obvious and kind of weird. And then he starts talking to Brandon, and whatever feelings Brandon might have or not have for Rupert are one-sided, because he says, he starts trying to explain the party, and he's like, I wanted to bring these books for Mr. Kentley, and then I remembered that Philip was going up to the country, so I thought I would make this sort of like a farewell party for Philip, and he's stammering really badly, like he has been since Rupert came. And Rupert kind of sneers at him, and he says, you always did stutter when you got excited. And he almost stutters the word stutter, like he's making fun of him there, too. I don't know. But Brandon says, well, I guess I'm always excited when I give a party. And kind of, you know, like a little boy would, like, kind of eager, like, and don't you like that? Like when you're trying to impress somebody much older than you, and Rupert says, well, I see. Like, kind of like, but I don't really, because I'm making fun of you, and you know that. And Brandon immediately jumps even further into being a child, and he goes, well, it's true. Like, well, I mean, I'm telling the truth. Don't you see that I'm saying what's real, Rupert? Don't you believe me? Don't you like me? Don't you like what I've done? I've thrown this whole party, and it was just to impress you. Isn't this great? And then for the rest of the party, until the climactic scene at the end when Rupert reveals that he knows Brandon and Phillip killed David, he continues to mock Brandon. Not overtly, but in that same subtle way, where he knows that Brandon loves him or admires him very much, or however you want to see it, and he's holding it over his head like a skillful, you know, manipulator. I mean, he's taking advantage of his position of power over Brandon, and he's just dangling it. It's disgusting. It's horrible. He when he confronts them initially, when Philip walks over to the champagne table and he says, you know, that he needs to have a drink because he thinks Rupert's caught on, and Brandon's like, well, he hasn't caught on, so take it easy. And then Rupert comes over, and Brandon gets kind of like nervous. And you can see Rupert kind of sneering at him a little bit there, but it's more so at the end when he confronts them about the murder itself. And Brandon says, well, we've always said that the lives of inferior beings are unimportant. And Rupert totally denies any culpability in it at all. And he just says, you know, oh, well, I never meant for my words to be interpreted that way. I know I said those things, but I didn't really mean them. I mean, what did you mean then? You have this grown man who was saying these things about superiority and murder to these impressionable 15, 16-year-old boys. And then he turns around and always saying, I mean, I don't know what that means, always saying, but Kenneth refers to Brandon and Rupert would talk together a lot alone. I mean, who knows what they were saying to each other then, and who knows what they were doing, really. So for him to then just turn around and be like, oh, well, I didn't really mean any of it. Well, what did you mean then, buddy? Good Lord. And it's just, you can see it in Brandon's face. His whole face just sort of collapses. And there's this like dawning horror in his eyes and on his mouth, and he realizes that Rupert is going to betray him. I think it's the first time in the movie when he realizes that Rupert doesn't really like him the way that he likes Rupert. And that this whole time, Brandon's been in love with Rupert, and Rupert has just been looking at him like a scientist might look at an interesting specimen in a microscope. And that he probably, when they were in school, just kind of looked at Brandon, and when he would do his little pranks or whatever he was doing, he would say, oh, well, there goes Brandon. Ha ha ha, it's so funny that he's just such a weird kid, and he's so weirdly intense about everything, and I guess I'll just amuse him and let him keep talking about Nietzsche, blah, blah, blah. You shouldn't have done that. Fucking asshole. Am I right? Okay. So, besides that, there's also Philip and Rupert, which is the least defined relationship in the movie, and also, in a way, the most complex. I mean, Philip and Brandon is complex because you don't really know how much. There's different ways to interpret how much Philip actually wanted to do any of it, and you know how I interpret it, because I think Philip wanted it just as much as Brandon did. Maybe more because Brandon wanted it than because Philip would have actually ever done anything like that himself alone, but I mean, so what? And then Brandon and Rupert is complicated because Rupert is using Brandon, and he's using a position of power to take advantage of somebody much, like at least 20 years younger than him, if not more. But with Philip and Rupert, you barely see them interact, and when they do interact, it's always very tense and angry and close. So Philip has this obvious resentment of Rupert that is just present from the beginning. When Brandon says that he invited him, he didn't tell Philip that he invited him, so you know already that even Brandon knows that Philip doesn't really like Rupert all that much. But why? It can be taken anyway. It could be due to jealousy because Philip knows that Brandon's a little bit in love with Rupert, or it could be taken as like Rupert had sex with Philip at some point, which, I mean, that's my personal opinion, just because Rupert seems like the type of person, and he would sort of view sex as like a conquest, like, you know, feelings are something for inferior people to have. And sex has to do with feelings, but only insofar as you let it. So he can have sex with somebody and he can conquer those feelings, and then it'll be like he's that much more superior, not just to everybody else, but especially to that person that he just had sex with. Which is kind of why, in a way, I almost think he did have sex with Brandon, but I don't really know for sure if he did, because he could have been wanting to manipulate him sexually, but he also might have not really cared enough about Brandon, just as viewing him as a specimen, or like as a butterfly pin to a board, you know, to really want to deal with him that much, and know that Brandon would then become clingy later, and be like, oh, well, Rupert, why don't you want to have sex again? So, but anyway, I think that he had sex with Philip because Philip would have just been a conquest, and because Philip was more recalcitrant, and because Philip was less into everything than Brandon. It would have made him more desirable, like a chase, you know, like, oh, well, he doesn't want me, so I have to want him more. It's like a challenge. Probably at Somerville, the preparatory school they went to, Philip noticed early on that Rupert saw a lot more than he should have about various things, like about the way that Philip was sexually, the way that Philip and Brandon were together, whatever. He noticed things that Philip wouldn't have wanted him to, and he didn't like that. So there would have been resentment on that part, and he didn't like that Rupert was always prying into things. I mean, he says it in the movie. What did you think was Rupert's best part of this party? Prying, snooping, or just plain pumping? Kind of sarcastically, implying that that's always been a problem for Philip with Rupert, that he's always in people's business and he doesn't need to be. And Philip also probably very much resents the fact that there's a lot of Rupert and Brandon, and that he's grown up to be like a sort of miniature Rupert almost. And that no matter what happens, I mean, whether whether they end up going to jail together or not, whether they would have ended up getting away with it or not, he would have always had that little tiny piece of Rupert stuck with him because he would have been with Brandon. And so he resents that hold that Rupert has over Brandon. And in a way, the hold that Rupert has over Phillip as well, because it's not like Phillip wasn't taking classes with him. I think Phillip was taking philosophy classes, or at least he was part of some sort of club with Brandon and the others. And so it's not like he wasn't sort of a mentor figure for Phillip as well. It was only natural that would have come about. So I think that Rupert manipulated Phillip just as much. And then in the end, he denies all that culpability. But it's interesting the way that he denies it, because he only talks to Brandon about it. He doesn't ever even acknowledge that Phillip had any part in it. So I don't really know how Rupert saw Phillip in terms of, like, capability of murder. Although he does say, "You're quite a good chicken strangler." I mean, I know everybody interprets that line as being really sexual, but I think he's also, in a way, saying, "I know that you're just as capable of murder as Brandon." And I don't think that Phillip liked that Rupert could see that in him. Even though I also don't think he minded that Brandon could see it, because Phillip really liked Brandon. Because for all Brandon's faults, at least he wasn't fake as shit about what he did or didn't like to do. I mean, Rupert, on the other hand, as you see, denies everything even remotely negative about him the minute that it gets thrown in his face. While Brandon just sort of doesn't. I mean, Brandon's very loud about everything and it has a lot to do with his age as well, but Brandon doesn't really seem to care as much that he thinks differently. Or if Brandon does care that he thinks differently, he knows that Phillip is on his side. And that Phillip's going to back him no matter what. But who knows? So anyway, that's my interpretation of the boys' relationships with each other and with their teacher. And I hope that you like this video, and please let me know what you think. Or don't. I mean, it's up to you. But that's just what I think, because I really love Brandon, and I was really tired of seeing wrong interpretations of him, and I wanted to kind of set the record straight on him and on his relationship with Phillip and on their relationship with Rupert. So thank you for watching.